Hi, everyone. Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hi, Sandy. Hi, everyone.
Sarah and I spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the United States and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we share our insights, experiences, and knowledge to inspire leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice.
In episode 3 of this season of our podcast, we described the social construction of cruelty. We described all the ways that human beings have contrived to make life miserable for other human beings. Today, we're going to focus on the people behind those constructions, the characteristics of human beings who make decisions to harm other people.
Yes, Sarah, given all the unnecessary suffering that is imposed on so many people, and given climate change that's imposed on all of us, as well as future generations, we usually find ourselves focusing on the victims, but not the perpetrators, the people and circumstances that permit and encourage all that suffering. These are people variously called sociopaths, antisocial personality disorders, psychopaths.
Yeah, it's kind of bananas that we don't pay more attention to these people because it means that we aren't doing anything to prevent the damage that they do. And we know that the problems that are at the root of malicious behaviors often begin in childhood. And yet, those childhood problems are rarely adequately addressed. And in many cases, it's because people don't know what to do.
Yeah, as it turns out, it has a lot to do with empathy and the way the brain develops. Empathy is a complex, multi-dimensional concept that reflects understanding the emotions of other people. Empathy has been defined as the attempt to actively understand the positive and negative experiences of others. And research has led to being able to differentiate two types of empathy: cognitive empathy and emotional empathy.
Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand and identify other people's emotions, while emotional empathy is the ability to be aware of and experience other people's emotions. Empathy turns out to be a positive predictor of moral development and pro-social behavior. While multiple studies also show that increased empathy correlates with decreased aggression and antisocial behavior, so a negative correlation.
Yeah, as it turns out, to experience concern about somebody else's welfare, you need somebody to be emotionally and empathically aroused and able to anticipate the ending of this mutually experienced personal distress. And without input from our own emotional system, which is called empathic arousal, moral behavior just is very difficult or impossible to develop. And this is best seen in children who do not respond emotionally to other people's suffering, and in adult psychopaths who understand cognitively what is right or wrong in a given situation. They just don't care because they have no moral conscience.
So antisocial behavior has a lot of indicators, like every other kind of behavior, but it's pretty complicated. And we might ask, is antisocial behavior learned? Is it inherited? Is it a problem of brain development? And it's interesting because research is showing us that there's some evidence for all three of these.
Yep. People who have studied childhood victimization have found that victimization was a significant predictor of the number of lifetime symptoms of antisocial personality disorder and of a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So high ACEs scores are pretty typical. Dr. James Garbarino, he put it this way. He said, over the past 20 years, I've sat with more than 100 killers, Many of them adolescents or young adults at the time they committed murder. I ask questions. I listen to their stories. I read the records and the files that document their lives, and I ask them the 10 adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs questions. Low scores are the exception. High scores are the rule.
There are also people studying the brains of antisocial people. And usually these are people who are involved with the justice system. And in that research, they find physiological problems like deficits in autonomic arousal, stuff like heart rate or breathing rate, deficits in attention to meaningful social cues, so the ability to read emotions or body language, deficits in orienting response, in sustained attention, deficits in electrodermal responses to distress cues. So the stuff that lie detector tests pick up, the skin response, a lack of fear to adverse events, lower heart rates after punishment, and fewer skin conductance responses after punishment. So not the same reaction to punishment that people who don't have antisocial tendencies display.
And then there's something called the antisocial pattern, which is that as parents, antisocial adults tend to elicit antisocial behavior in their children, and that perpetuates those patterns then across generations. So in those families, antisocial behavior is normative. Parenting behavior apparently has a great deal to do with children developing antisocial traits as well, particularly harsh, cruel, inconsistent behavior where the parents lack emotional warmth for the children. And that all increases the likelihood of antisocial behavior emerging in the children.
So we use the term sociopath, but clinically, that would be someone who's diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. And some of the behavior patterns that we would see in that disorder are ignoring social norms and laws, breaking rules at school or work, overstepping social boundaries, stealing, stalking, harassing, destroying property, dishonesty and deceit, using fake identities, manipulating other people for gain, having a hard time controlling impulses, planning for the future, or acting without consideration of consequences. These are also people who tend to be more aggressive and are frequently getting into fights or physical conflict with other people. They have a disregard for personal safety, their own or other people's. Um, they have a hard time managing their responsibilities, including things like showing up at work, doing tasks, paying rent, bills, and they often have little or no guilt or remorse. And instead, they tend to justify their actions that negatively affect other people.
Yeah, people with antisocial personality disorder usually show little emotion or interest in the lives of other people. They might come across as arrogant or superior with firmly fixed opinions. They use humor, if they have it, intelligence, and their own charisma, again, if they have it, to manipulate other people. Can seem charming at first until their own self-interest becomes clear. People with, it's also called ASPD for the initials, antisocial personality disorder. They generally find it challenging to maintain friendships because, people figure them out, at least sometimes. And they usually don't have mutually fulfilling connections over time. And this difficulty may stem from traits like they don't have much empathy. They don't have much emotional intelligence. They have difficulty learning from their mistakes. As you mentioned, they don't have any concern really for the safety of other people. And instead of a tendency to intimidate and threaten in order to actually maintain control over others.
Yeah, and a life course trajectory for people who fit this description is often like a really troubled childhood, then delinquency in adolescence, and then a lifetime of involvement in the criminal justice system. But persistent chronic offenders tend to represent just a small portion of the population.
Yeah, the small group of life course persistent offenders has been found to be characterized by being difficult to manage, even at age 2, under controlled at age 3, and really often are diagnosed with neurocognitive impairments at that age. And this subgroup of lifelong persistent offenders become not only engaged in serious violence in adulthood, but also experience adverse physical health and mental health and all kinds of economic problems later in life.
Yeah, we both, mentioned a couple of times that this is a small subgroup, which really means that those persistent offenders are just the tip of the iceberg and not even close to all the people who have serious personality dysfunction. And that means there are a lot of people out there, since these personality traits affect about 10% of the population, according to the research. And they have what's been called dark traits. And these are people who have actually become what we call successful psychopaths, and they run corporations and even countries.
Yeah, these dark traits are called Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, and sadism. So we better describe what we mean by those terms, what these dark traits are. Machiavellianism is named after a guy people have probably heard of, a 16th century Italian political thinker named Niccolo Machiavelli. And it's characterized by manipulativeness, cunning, and a use of deception for personal gain. It's often associated with long-term and strategic planning of the use of those abilities, less pro-social behavior, and it's a lot about power seeking. There's typically a duplicitous interpersonal style, a cynical disregard for morality, and a huge focus on self-interest and personal gain.
Yeah, people with this trait really don't have a reference point for moral standards. And they will kind of take the position that the ends justify the means. And that means they're likely to advocate a political approach to managing their lives and relationships. And that includes using kind of a fake persona, pretending to be honest or charming or tactful, but really only to gain an advantage. And these are people who are very willing to advocate for the use of force if they feel it's necessary to meet their own ends.
Narcissism is named after a character in Greek mythology, Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection in a pool of water. So narcissism is characterized by a grandiose self-concept, an excessive sense of self-importance and self-worth, and a general lack of concern for other people, while at the same time craving admiration and the attention of others. One idea about it is that these are people who actually hold a very vulnerable self-concept that requires this constant validation and reinforcement from other people.
Psychopathy is the third dark trait. And that one includes cold-heartedness, a tendency toward thrill-seeking behaviors, and impulsivity. These are people who don't have a conscience, although they pretend they do. And that makes it easy for them to lie and deceive others pretty convincingly. Notably, that callous and unemotional nature of psychopaths makes them particularly prone to aggression. And there's a lot of research now showing that psychopathy is associated with brain or abnormalities that are probably neurodevelopmental in nature.
Yeah. And then a type of psychopath exists who is not prone to outbursts of impulsive, violent criminal behavior, and who therefore live relatively undetected and therefore successfully in society. They're called successful psychopaths, also called snakes in suits. They've been called successful psychopaths because they successfully evade any contact with legal authorities. And you may have worked with or for one of these. In organizations, they present themselves as kind of glibly unbothered by the chaos around them, unconcerned about those who have lost their jobs or their savings or their investments. They don't have any regret about what they have done and how they may have contributed to other people's downfall. They cheerfully lie about their involvement in events. They're very persuasive in blaming others and never taking any responsibility themselves. It's always somebody else's fault. They have no doubts about their continued worth and value, and they're happy to walk away from any disaster that they've managed to bring about with as big a payoff as they can get, and with new roles, advising governments how to prevent those same economic disasters that they've caused.
Yeah. The fourth of the dark traits is sadism. And people who are high in sadism sort of enjoy inflicting unnecessary pain on others. They kind of get a kick from it, like a positive charge. And sadistic personality is defined as a person who humiliates others, shows a long-standing pattern of cruel or demeaning behavior to others, or intentionally inflicts physical, sexual, or psychological pain or suffering on others in order to assert power and dominance or for pleasure and enjoyment.
Yeah, just for the fun of it. It's really hard to imagine that. But ethically bad leaders are said to be callously disregarding of the needs and wishes of other people. And they're reported to be really prepared to cheat, lie, and bully, and to disregard or cause harm to the welfare of others. All these traits are commonly associated with psychopaths in the literature. And the study of psychopaths within organizations is really therefore called for. We should be able to identify these folks. After all, it only takes one bad leader to bring down an entire long-standing organization. And so it's really time to carry out management research into what are really ethically and morally dysfunctional leaders. It's long overdue.
Yeah, and there are a lot of them. I think a good example of a successful psychopath is Bernie Madoff, the ex-chairman of NASDAQ. And people who reported on his disastrous Ponzi scheme, they reported that he shared many of the traits of a psychopath, and he was, genial, charismatic, but greedy and manipulative, and he did not care who he hurt in the process as long as he was getting wealthy.
Yeah, his psychopathic traits helped him to climb the corporate ladder and inevitably brought down his downfall. He was described as a terrific salesman and as a leading celebrity in financial circles. It was reported that he showed absolutely no remorse or regret when he was confronted with his crimes. He ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history and fraudulently took more than $60 billion from his investors.
But the thing about a Ponzi scheme is that eventually it collapses. Like it can't go on forever. And so this really shows his lack of fear of getting caught. Like eventually this was going to all fall apart and he was going to be found out. But in his own mind, he wasn't afraid of that or didn't expect that that would happen. And his desire to accumulate wealth, to dominate other people and prove his intelligence allowed him to dupe these investors and regulators for years. But people who worked for him described him as ruthless and detached. And he showed very little remorse for robbing his victims of their life savings. He left people emotionally traumatized, financially impoverished, depressed, and even some of his victims were suicidal in the wake of his arrest.
Yeah. And Sarah, there's some really worrisome data about all of this. There was a large, comprehensive, multinational study of corporate psychopathy, and it was based on 7 companies, 3 US based and 4 global companies with US subsidiaries, ranging in size from 150 to more than 40,000 employees worldwide. 9 of the 203 managers and executives who took part were, according to this research, undoubtedly psychopaths. That's almost 5% of the managers and executives. Moreover, the study showed that there were no significant differences in the general nature and structure of psychopathy in the corporate sample in comparison with that found in samples from the offender psychiatric and community-based psychopathic populations.
Yeah. So the people who are identified as psychopaths who end up in prison, very similar to the psychopaths who end up leading our corporations, our companies, and sometimes even our countries. One of the researchers suggests that the types of institutional behavior that a psychopath who's leading a corporation might engage in, so ways to recognize if your company or your organization is being run by a psychopath, is unfeeling and hard treatment of employees, abrupt terminations of employment, like you're fired, unhealthy and environmentally damaging business practices, dangerous and unhealthy working conditions, and the breaking of human rights conventions and laws of employment.
And as you would think, the workplace environment that these people create is not a good place to work. It's characterized by lots of conflict, bullying behavior that's pretty constant, an increased workload that's too much for people to handle, low levels of job satisfaction, higher than necessary organizational constraints. People typically humiliate other people. Lies and deceit are accepted. There's verbal and even physical abuse all over the place. The use of organizational rules to actually control other people, not for any useful organizational purpose, inadequate training of people when they join the organization, blaming of other people, a real blame culture. Any mistake, it's your fault. You did it. And often unwanted sexual activities and coercion that goes along with that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important that we start to really evaluate the risks and listen to some of the warnings, because there are a lot of listeners, I'm sure, who are hearing these lists and thinking, "Oh my God, I am working for a psychopath." Um, and there's a quote from the book that you were referring to called Snakes in Suits. And it's the fact is that many organizations are prime feeding grounds for psychopaths with an entrepreneurial bent and the requisite personal attributes and social skills to fool many people. Like all predators, psychopaths go where the action is. which to them means positions, occupations, professions, and organizations that afford them the opportunity to obtain power, control, status, and possessions, and to engage in exploitative interpersonal relationships.
I think, Sarah, what's most worrisome about all of this that we're talking about is that politics is a really good feeding ground for people with these kinds of dark traits, because politics is about power, and it's also about manipulating the population. So what is really scary is that someone who is in fact a psychopath could run a country. And we see that in different places of the world, that there are people who are psychopaths who are running countries. Dictators tend to be psychopaths. And therefore, it's really scary and makes democracy so incredibly important, that people get out and voice their opinion about what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and that we learn to listen to our gut instinct about what we might not be hearing overtly, but what is actually going on.
So we want to thank you for listening to Creating Presence. Coming up after the break, we'll talk about how we can create social immunity to avoid elevating people who fit that dark triad into leadership positions. And we also want to encourage you to vote. And we also want to encourage you to really think about the balance between charming and engaging and deceitful kinds of behaviors. We'll be back after these messages.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And today we're talking about corporate psychopaths, the dangers they create for people. And now we want to discuss social immunity. If we think about the presence of some people who act as predators, like predatory viruses do, then there must be something we can do to make sure our social immune systems are in good working order.
So let's say a little bit about what we mean by social immune systems. Maintaining secure system is fundamental to life. In our bodies, the immune system really creates that security for our whole bodies. And none of the other bodily functions really matter if we don't have our immune system, because before we're even able to grow into adulthood, we will have succumbed to a host of any infectious agents that are competing for life space, and that are likely to use up yours until you're dead.
Yeah. To protect us against hostile invaders and promote repair and recovery when such invasion has occurred, we do have this incredible immune system. It's a subsystem that runs in parallel with the other systems of our bodies. Things go wrong in our bodies when an infectious agent overwhelms our immune system, when the immune system itself misidentifies invaders as friends, or when it mounts an overwhelming response to what is actually a non-lethal threat.
Right, like an allergic reaction. If you've been listening to our podcast, you'll know that Sandy and I talk a lot about the comparison between organizations and living systems, and really thinking about organizations as living systems. So organizational bodies have immune systems as well. And that's what we mean when we use the term social immune system. It's defined as the social body's ability to recognize and respond to threats to its well-being. And since we know a lot about how a healthy human immune system works, it's possible to also identify those characteristics of a healthy social immune system. So when a threat enters the social body, complex social processes are set into motion to defend and protect that social body against the emergence of violence. So when we're thinking about, germs as invaders to human bodies, we're really thinking about violence as an infection to the social body.
Yeah. And that requires all of us to really shift our understanding about what we mean by violence. It requires us to understand violation as an emergent group phenomenon that indicates that something has gone wrong with our social immunity, any kind of violence.
And if we look at it from that perspective, the violent individual is the weak link in a complex web of interactions. And that culminates in a kind of violation after a kind of cascade of previous apparently nonviolent events. So when violence has occurred, the entire group has really failed to prevent it, right? The whole immune system, the social immune system, not just the individuals who were immediately involved.
And that's really important because the bystander is never innocent. It means shifting our premise in that way means that instead of only chasing after and punishing whoever the ostensible violator was, we have to ask, how did our social immunity break down? And how do we protect and enhance our social immune system so that the same thing doesn't happen again?
And I think what you're saying, it's, I think, important to, clarify that this is not like victim blaming or bystander blaming, right? It's very different from that. It's really understanding the systemic failure that led to some kind of violence, and that everyone who's part of a community is part of that social immune response. So the way that every part of our body plays a role in the immune system, so does every member of an organization in being protective. And in the system, everybody's interconnected. So any breach in those connections that kind of create the stability within the system means a break in the social immunity. And that becomes the vulnerable place where the infection of violence is most likely to emerge.
Now, there are some basic principles we can talk about in terms of what makes a healthy social immune system. And the first one is it gets a healthy start in life. In our bodies, our original immunity comes from our connection to our mothers, and the healthier the mother, the healthier the baby. Organizations don't arise through spontaneous generation. They're always predecessors, ancestors, from which the new organization is evolving as a living being. So it's important to recognize and honor, as we talked about in an earlier podcast, the history, the memory, the organizational memory, gathering lessons learned from past experience with the same problems that the organization is aiming to address now. How did the organization deal with threats to its well-being in the past when it was young and more vulnerable? Or have new threats arisen that its early life didn't prepare it for? Did it get the healthy start it needed, or are there inherited gaps in the security system that need to be repaired? This gets into the issue of collective memory that makes it so important.
Yeah, in health, the immune system is always on, right? In humans, in our bodies, and the healthier we are, the better able our immune system is to kind of mount the right defense against whatever germs, viruses, and bacteria invade us. That's kind of why we're not always sick. But a healthy immune system is supported by a healthy lifestyle throughout childhood. When growth is happening and maturity is developing, if we're exposed to toxic stress and adversity, that disrupts the development of that immune system. And when we think about that in connection to the moral development, right? Think about how important parenting is, how important schools are, things like character education and DEI programs for creating that healthy environment, not just for our physical immune system, but for building the foundation of healthy social immune systems.
At an organizational level, that means that the group has both tangible and intangible resources necessary for it to function. And there's a recognition that inevitably there will be people involved who have high ACEs scores, high exposure to adversity in their childhoods, and that when we're talking particularly about caregiving work, it's hard. So maintaining a healthy social immune system means that the group has to set clear norms and expectations around creating and maintaining a safety culture, while every individual is expected to be able to manage their own emotions. That's why we have emotional volumes plans as well as their own wellness. That's why we endorse wellness plans.
Yeah, in creating presence, we also really work on evaluating rules and norms in an organization, and really to kind of think back to what you were saying earlier, Sandy, about how we have to have clear understanding around expectations so that we can recognize violations of those norms, because it's such a slippery slope from what seems like a minor violation to becoming an episode of violence. To remain healthy, a social group has to decide on the way they're going to communicate with each other. And they have to establish clear lines and methods of communication while also agreeing on how they're going to make decisions. So here is where our creating presence skills around communication and around complexity management and shared decision making can really support that social immune system. And they also have to share their historical experiences and the lessons that they've learned, including group and community trauma assessments.
In your body, your immune system is always active when you're in health. It's gathering information over time. It stores that information. It's able to access it when it's needed at a later time. But the immune system also learns from experience and adapts to any kind of change. So a healthy social immune system shares an extensive knowledge base among all of its members and holds on to knowledge from previous experience. This means that there has to be a shared knowledge base around the impacts of chronic stress and adversity and trauma, as well as knowledge about attachment and disrupted attachment, and the multiple ways that all of these factors can affect the immune system in individuals and in systems in a wide variety of negative ways.
Yeah, they also have to have sufficient tangible and intangible resources for the social immune system to function properly. So tangible things are like locks on the doors, uh, all of the things that sort of help us create that sense of protection. And intangible resources might be things like skills. And we have a lot to offer in the area of skills. But we also have to be able to really recognize the impact of trauma on the people who are being served, as well as the people who are providing those services. That's part of a healthy immune system too, realizing and recognizing what injuries have happened, and how that's created a response. Whether that response has been successful in the past or whether that response has been too much or too little.
Yeah, and your
So,
body,
yeah.
the perimeter is guarded by your skin. And there are specialized cells that warn of any threat. So help then is mobilized rapidly whenever there's a threat, while different immune cells have specialized tasks, experts that they can call in to deal with different kinds of threats. So similarly, a healthy social immune system protects its perimeter. It does that by the community identifying values, norms, and rules to be established, and then has a clear, practical value system in constant use that new members are carefully oriented about and adequately trained in, so that everybody is really well acquainted with the organizational norms.
And this is a really important part of what we do in creating presence, helping to really articulate those norms. Also, looking at how we help with hiring and onboarding processes, incident response protocols, so that there are loops back to bystanders. All of these ways that we can use our content, our knowledge, skills, and policies and practice suggestions to support that adequate training and bolster that social immune system. And it's also helpful to think about, the perimeter, right? When we're talking about the social immune system, we want to think about the borders, and everyone who's part of the system has a role in its social immunity. But often there are people who have a significant role that we don't pay a lot of attention to. Those are the folks who don't have a lot of formal authority, but a lot of um, responsibility for helping that protective social immune system. Thinking about people who do building repair, cleaning, providing food, even people who are tasked with security. They're the ones who often notice the trouble first. They're the ones who kind of see the problem because they're kind of inside and outside at the same time. So making sure that we have feedback loops so that what they see and hear can be acted on. I also think, Sandy, that there's an important element here to talk about too, with regard to boards of directors. And the reason is that they are the ones who hire the executive team, primarily the CEO of an organization. And so in creating presence, because of what we know about psychopaths, successful psychopaths, and how easily they can rise to the top of an organization, climb that ladder, leaving, disaster in their wake, we actually have some processes for helping boards of directors really look at issues around empathy, how to do interviewing, how to understand not just what the person who is being interviewed for a leadership position is saying about themselves, but really about what other people who've worked with that person say about them. Because psychopaths are really charming and they tend to overestimate their own empathy. So really thinking about what is important for the board of directors to be looking for in those hiring practices, that is part of trauma-informed practice.
They are also the people who guard the perimeter. They're the relationship to the outside world and to the organization, and it has to really be vital to maintaining the integrity of the organizational culture. And the communication network has to be all inclusive from all of these parts, right? Evidence of any weakening or breach of the culture that includes a break in the perimeter must then provoke an immediate coordinated response by the entire group.
Yeah, in our bodies, we talk about that as an inflammatory response. It's what happens to all of our cells when the immune system recognizes, like, uh-oh, there's some danger. We have to, respond. And billions of cells rush to the site of an injury or an infection, and they begin the healing process while trying to kill or eliminate the danger. So healthy immune system accurately and promptly recognizes danger, and it mounts the appropriate inflammatory response. So when there's a violation of physical, psychological, social, moral, or cultural safety within or coming from outside of the organization, the social immune system also has to respond. And you like to call it using the Goldilocks rule, right? Goldilocks said it's not too big, not too small, it's just right.
Exactly. Interpersonal or intergroup dysfunction and conflict, whether it's overt or covert, is really the alarm bell of the social immune system. And it should bring attention to the emerging disturbance without minimizing the problem or overreacting. That's the Goldilocks thing, just right. Complex organizations are going to encounter conflicts that are often quite difficult to manage. So a healthy social immune system is able to mobilize and recruit help and support when necessary because the communication system is adequate and prepared so that others can be alerted to danger and recruited to help plan and address the danger by using either internal or external resources, getting external consultation.
You and I have actually both been that external consultation for a number of organizations. And I think I hadn't until this moment recognized us as part of their social immune response, but that's exactly what it is. Um, and we talked about how those small scale boundary violations lead to larger scale violations that leads to conflict, that's likely to produce chronic symptoms of distress and disturbance. And I think of those as like micro tears in the fabric of the social immune system. Um, and you and I have, as I said, done some of that work, and a lot of it starts with conflict resolution, like helping people in leadership, uh, do some repair work as part of that bolstering of the social immune system.
Yeah, understanding and managing unsafe behavioral violations isn't the same as ignoring and overlooking the unsafe behavior, which has to be identified, confronted, and lead to growth-promoting consequences. But the consequences, it's very important to say, have to be designed to instruct and restore safety while strengthening the social immune system over time. So in that way, the social immune system of an organization is able to adapt to change and learn from experience. Once the danger has become effectively addressed, the social immune system can go back to normal alert status.
Yeah, it's important, I think, too, to think about how a healthy social immune system gathers information over time and remembers that information. But I'm also thinking about how the immune system responds to like the call is coming from inside the house situation, where your social immune system, it starts to realize that it's not a threat coming from somewhere else. It's actually coming from your own leader. And we've had experiences of, working in organizations and with organizations where there's been toxic leadership. And usually the only way that that gets really identified, it's like an infection. Lots of people leave the organization. That's the symptom that finally gets the attention. But in thinking about, gathering that information and remembering that information, the social immune system has to look at the characteristics of the danger and identify the vulnerabilities of the immune system. So basically asking, like, where did things break down? What happened to our social immunity that allowed us to hire this person and allowed this person to wreak havoc in our organization?
Yep. A healthy social immune system includes the entire body. That's the bottom line. It is a biocracy within a larger biocracy. For a social immune system to be effective, it must be a system, meaning it must include the entire organizational body as component parts of social immunity. And the best methods for ensuring a whole organizational response is putting democratic participatory practices in place from the very start of the organization. The greater the frequency of democratic decision-making and practice, the greater the resistance to violence in human groups.
And some of the ways that we get really specific to create a healthier, more robust social immune system is, as I mentioned, like hiring practices. How do we think about who we let in to work in our organization? Once they come in, how do we support them with the knowledge that we need and create the norms and expectations so that the culture encourages them to grow in a positive way rather than to become susceptible to any, germ infestations of violence or boundary violations. Also thinking about how we evaluate performance in creating presence. We talk a lot about not just looking at performance evaluation from the position of tasks or accomplishing specific metrics. Metrics. We're always kind of talking in this quantitative way to evaluate people, but really thinking about their degree of empathy, their expressions of social protection, the degree to which they support and collaborate and use power effectively. Embedding those components in the structures, right? Really institutionalizing these protections can make a world of difference in strengthening the social immunity at the organizational level. Thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to create a healthy society. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.